which is why players will turn towards h6. The reason that this was sort of ignored for a long time, I mean, I remember making a lot of attempts to make f6 really playable with this knight h6 line, because I was scared of h6 knight h3 as being even more powerful, because now black hasn't even got this knight h6 idea. The answer is e6, which strangely enough, I mean, I didn't see this move until I joined Fix in about 2005, which is about a year after this whole idea came to light. And there it was quite common knowledge, but on ICC no one knew about it. So it's quite funny how this cross-pollination of ideas sometimes occurs and sometimes doesn't. But if white plays a natural knight b5, queen h4, g3, queen e4, queen takes c2, and this bishop b4 threat's coming in. We'll go into this more detail in the theory section, but you can see knight takes a7. White can say, you know, hooray, I must exchange up, but bishop b4 ends the game. So h6, after that line was demonstrated, it seemed h6 was certainly a playable alternative. And after this e6 move was discovered, there was a sort of maybe a crossing paths of how the knight h3 players approached it. Some players tried to play a more sophisticated lines with knight c3, going into b5, and playing the line we just saw. Obviously not falling for knight takes a7, but maybe bishop g2, and going for some positional pressure. It's quite difficult, this line, actually, for black. He has to really know what he's doing. In fact, white's doing quite well here. Black needed to come up with this move a6, which is another move from Trojan Knight. But after this move was discovered, this whole opening for white lost a lot of bite, and a few key games showed that black was doing quite well. So white players instead turn to 2e3, which is clearly the most critical move, and will be the main line in the theory sections from later on. And for a long time it seemed like black had nothing better than accepting a bad position. There are quick refutations of some moves. f5, queen h5 is quite strong here, but also knight h4, knight f4, sorry, e6, knight g6. I don't think there's any need to go any further than that, really. White's got a very strong knight for no compensation. What else can you try here? No, there's nothing really else there, is there? e6 is the most common move. Knight f4, and now white's threatening to jump with his knight into either h5 or d5, and it's quite hard to see how black can stop both. For example, f5 here, queen f3, opening up an attack on f7. The knight's now threatening to move to g6 and d5, and there's nothing really black can do here. Again, f5 is again bad, just transposes to the line we've already seen. So the most common move was g6. The problem is that knight h5 comes in anyway, simply because if black takes it, queen h5 wins on the spot. So, in order to avoid knight, well, you can't really avoid knight g7, but in order to drum up some counterplay, black started to look at lines of queen h4, g3, and for a long time this seemed quite forced, really, for black. You just had to allow white to have this really powerful knight on g7 without any compensation, and just hope that things turned out well in the long run, which they usually didn't. I remember having quite a long joint analysis session with Siggy Mannon, in terms we tried to find some counterplay ideas for black, and we came up with quite an interesting idea: queen b4. The idea of this move is to give up the queen for a bunch of pieces on b2. Usually this is quite a double-edged idea, but seeing as black was, you know, seemed quite preferable to grovelling and doing nothing, Um, Unfortunately, in this position, Queen A4 simply wins for white, so it sort of put a stop on it in this particular position. C6, you come into F4. Oh, my apologies. Queen F4 first, followed by Queen C7. But with this in mind, it seemed we kind of the idea of playing Queen E4 first, then after Knight G5, King D8, D3, rather than playing the traditional Queen F3, play Queen B4, and now Queen takes B2. And now Queen A4 doesn't win on the spot at all, because White's played Knight G7 rather than Queen F4 in the other line. I'm not quite sure what the theoretical valuation of this position is. I suspect White's still doing quite well, especially in practice. I managed to win a few games when it first came out with Black, but after White players sort of stopped catching them by surprise, came up with some quite strong ideas, especially Peter Patzer or Wild Killer. But unfortunately, a new idea came out: Queen F3 in this position, sacrificing a pawn, and I've got a feeling this position is very strong for White after Knight G5, Knight G7. In fact, it's possibly even stronger than having the pawn on E3, simply because the open E file gives White so many options to invade with the rook. In fact, I think I've had a very good record from White here, and I'd never go for this line as Black. Fortunately, as is often the case, as that came to light, a new idea also came up for Black: Knight C6. The first strong player I saw using this was Onyebenze, or GM Onyebenze, on free chess. He's one of the strongest of type players in the world, possibly the strongest, depending on whose opinion you ask for. And I hadn't looked at it much before because I just assumed it was a bad move. Following Bishop B5, I thought, how can Black prevent Knight D5 coming in? It just looked sort of suicidal. So I decided to play this against him and see what happened. And this is how our game went: D5, which obviously prevents Knight takes D5, because despite the check, of course, Black can play Queen takes D2, winning. So to renew the threat, you simply move to D pawn. Now Knight takes D5 is again a very strong idea. And now he played Knight F6. I'll be going into why later, but I feel that Black has a stronger move here. But this is also very tricky. White has to be very careful. I made quite a big mistake and played Knight takes D5 check. But after C6, it's very hard to see how White can really defend, because Black's Knight's coming into E4 or G3, preventing that with F3, which is what I played, Knight D5. And now the Queen is threatening to come out to H4 and win, so that needs to be prevented. But if White does prevent that, say F4, the Knight is coming into B4, maybe after an exchange of queens, and Black's, well, effectively winning there. Another trick is Knight G6, which seems like the other very strong move. Oh, sorry, Knight takes E6, we'll look at that first. Knight takes E6, Bishop G4, F3, Bishop G5, Bishop F5, and now, in addition to threatening on C2, Black's also opened up the Queen H4 threat again, coming into G3 with a win. The critical move for Black is F3, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail in the theory section, but I think Black's got quite a few problems here. But I mean, that was enough, really, this game, with these tactics popping up that make me think, maybe this Knight C6 idea is not quite as bad as I thought to start with. And yeah, I uncovered quite a lot of very interesting lines. So yeah, just a quick summary of what we've gone through so far. The only two really reasonable moves against knight h3 are h6 and f6, which we looked at first. After f6, knight c3, black seems to have problems which, well, I can't solve them myself, and I've never seen anyone else solve them to my satisfaction. So h6 is the only move left, really. And then after e3, which is a critical move, e6, knight f4 is the most dangerous opening for white. Knight c6 is sort of the latest word on the theory, and on current evidence, it's really the only way black can achieve a good game if white continues playing in the most critical and accurate way. The only other place I'd recommend looking is this g6 and queen over to b2 idea that me and Siggy Mannon came up with a while back. But in this case, black really has to have an answer to queen f3, and I do not trust that line for black. So okay, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll come back for the next video, which will be about the typical themes and ideas in the Trojan Knight opening after h6. Okay, thank you, and hope you come back.